Okay, so first of all, thanks to all of you for joining me here today to talk about this topic of mastering customer information with the graph. So just to introduce myself, I work for Pitney Software, who I'll talk a little bit about kind of where we are in this space here in a minute. I am a product manager specifically in our customer information management line of business. And there's my Twitter handle as well if any of you want to interact with me there. So we're here today to, again, talk about mastering customer information and the power that the graph can really bring to that to enable an agile enterprise. One of the biggest challenges that we see out there in the marketplace today is that a lot of the traditional solutions in this space lack that agility. So you wind up with waterfall-style methodologies to implement these kind of projects, which create all the challenges that any of us that have been working in an agile development mode for the years that it's been around now recognize, right? And fundamentally, those are large investments, no iterative feedback as we proceed along in developing solutions, and at the end, we wind up many times with a solution that doesn't fit our business needs, doesn't fit our business requirements because of the lack of the agility that we had when designing and implementing the solution. So that's a key piece of what I'll talk about here today. So just to quickly introduce Pitney Bowes, many of you may know Pitney Bowes is a mailing company. It's almost a 100-year-old company, been around for a very long time. The founders were one of the first inventors of some of the postage meters that a lot of people use today in the back office. So what I'm going to talk about today doesn't have anything to do with any of that. We have a software division, essentially, that's called our Digital Commerce Solutions division. That is comprised of 5 main lines of business. So we have a location intelligence business to really support adding location context for business data, and I'll talk about that as part of our domain as well. Customer engagement for delivering relevant interactions across your customer life cycle. Shipping and mailing as part of the DCS division as well to really drive mailing efficiency, and a global e-commerce division focused on kind of simplifying the global marketplace and providing predictable results. My line of business that I work specifically in as a product manager, again, is customer information management. And a lot of that is about connecting relevant data, providing context across all kinds of digital and physical boundaries. And again, we're going to talk today about the key piece that the graph database plays in what we're doing. So to kind of kick it off here, the mission that we see for customer information management out there in the enterprise and most of the customers that we work with today is really about having strategic CIM enable agility in the business. And what that's all about is to be competitive, to differentiate out there in the marketplace today. A large part of what that's about is really having the capacity to identify and capture opportunities quicker than your rivals. And we'll see, a lot of the traditional solutions to managing customer information, as I mentioned before, really struggle with that aspect of agility. So it's a key piece of our product vision to really enable that agility, and additionally to enable a strong set of collaborative efforts between the business and the IT sides of the house. We frequently find in our meetings with customers, potential customers, typically that there's not a very good set of collaboration between these things. We find that a lot of times solutions are purchased, kind of thrown over the wall to the IT department. The collaboration kind of breaks down at that point, and we wind up with the situations that I mentioned before, where there's a lot of investment having been made and very little business value being realized. The highest number I've heard in that regard is $40 million with a local bank that I met with in the U.S. a couple months ago. So it's a pretty staggering thing if you think about it. Now, why does managing customer information matter? This is a study that was done by a company called Watermark Consulting and also picked up by Forrester recently, who's a kind of a key analyst in this space. This looks at the performance of customer experience leaders versus those that are laggards, or even versus the typical S&P 500 index. It looked at their financial return on the marketplace as it relates to their kind of correlation with leading from a customer experience perspective. And you can see here it's a really dramatic difference, right? Those that were leaders outperformed the market by a significant percentage. Those that were laggards underperformed the market by a significant percentage. So really, what makes that possible is data, right? And it's all about turning data into information and turning that information into strategy and insight into your customer base. So this kind of drives home the importance of why we even care about this, why it needs to be part of our core process within our organization. So if you look at the way information is available and provided out there in the marketplace today, it really requires new approaches for a number of the things I've already mentioned. There's been a really exponential change that we've all seen and been involved in as it relates to information dynamics over the last several years. So the speed at which data arrives, the complexity that it kind of contains, the different varieties that we have to deal with, whether we're talking about sort of standard feeds from enterprise systems, or we're talking about social media, or increasingly we're talking about streaming data with the Internet of Things, disconnected data sources. It really creates some very big challenges for a lot of organizations. How do I pull all of that into a multidimensional view of my customer? How do I action that to be able to really kind of provide that information in real time out to people that are customer facing and improve that customer experience along the lines of what we talked about on the last slide. So the dynamics have changed a lot. I think what you see with a lot of solutions out there on the marketplace is that they have not evolved to meet these challenges, and they face a lot of real problems in implementing to kind of address these challenges. So, along with that, the expectations that the customers have of your organization have really, increased exponentially as well. So what we need is a new approach to provide that relevance in customer communications, to provide that value, and really to do that in a way that's very immediate and supports a very seamless experience. We're all customers of various companies, whether it's a bank or an insurance company or an airline. I'm sure everybody in this room could probably cite an example of an interaction that they've had with a company that was less than optimal. So that's why we all have kind of our own personal examples of why this is important and really needed, why a new approach is needed to this marketplace. If we talk about master data management specifically, which is kind of a key component of CIM, what you'll see there, and I know this is a little difficult to read up on the screen there, but we've kind of had an evolution along these same lines, right? So it begins with single views of individuals. So that's comprises domains like data integration, ETL, being able to pull data from different sources. It involves data cleansing, data quality, matching processes, enrichment processes, quite often to deal with things like context around location, very important. So that's kind of step one, right? And what a lot of folks have been doing for quite some time now is building these single view of individuals. But as we saw on the last slide, it's a lot more than that in today's day and age. So we look at the view of individual relationships. So what products do these customers own? What are their kind of household relationships? What are their connections to one another out there in the marketplace? What are their relations to other organizations or within organizations that they work for? What are their relationships from a social networking perspective? Very key in understanding the customer base today. And what are their relations to various locations, right? Where do they live? Where do they work? Where do they frequently shop? Those kind of things. So that's sort of the next step out in the evolution, right? Following that, we want to really understand their interactions with our company. So whether that's through traditional systems or processes like sales, billing, or support, or also, as I mentioned before, increasingly understanding social media and our interactions there. So I don't know if anybody out there does this. Probably there's at least a few of us that do. But a lot of what you see now is people interacting directly with organizations over mediums like Facebook and Twitter. I see a lot of that in some of the customers that I'm talking with as well. So understanding those interactions both through traditional systems as well as kind of social media is very important as well. And then ultimately what we want to drive to is insight. Again, turning that data into insight and turning that insight into strategy. Being able to apply analytical capabilities to it, being able to explore the data kind of dynamically, being able to predict outcomes, and being able to really optimize those interactions with our customers and drive that customer experience to really improve the performance and competitiveness of our organization out there in the marketplace. The traditional approaches to this space, specifically as they relate to MDM, deal with relational schemas typically. I'm sure that you guys have heard a lot, in all the other talks about the advantages that Graph provides over a relational system. So a big problem in enabling an Agile Enterprise is the rigidity that our DBMS kind of has baked into it. Very limited views to kind of to allow the business to really force them to know all the questions up front as they're designing the system, as opposed to a more interactive way to explore. Very long implementation cycles that again result in frequent times value not being delivered. Very difficult to change once we've got it in place. So, modifying a relational schema, even something as simple as adding a column, is something that can take, I've seen it take upwards of 6 months in large organizations. So the agility and kind of the schema-free nature of the graph really suits itself to evolving quickly and dynamically in an agile manner. So again, understanding your business, as we all know from agile approaches, the only context is change, so we got to be able to adjust to that change. We have to be able to support multi-dimensional views of our customer base, be able to search them with the appropriate contextual information, and we have to support real-time access. Information management is no longer about running a batch job once a night or running it once a weekend. It's about how do I get real-time access into these various pieces, both to retrieve information about a customer from multi-dimensional view, but also to deal with things like duplication. So we have a very strong capability in matching that companies like Salesforce are OEMing inside their own products to deal with deduplication of their customers. So a big piece of it is that real-time access and support for that. So talking a little bit about our partnership with Neo4j, I think we've been partnered for right around 4 or 5 years now. We started looking at Graph and Neo4j specifically back in 2010, mostly around some use cases that involved network analysis type applications. But as we kind of dove into it and on a separate thread sort of realized that we needed to participate in the MDM marketplace, our core kind of capabilities were mostly then focused around data quality. But we saw quickly one of the key trends in information management is that people don't want to stitch together multiple solutions to enable a use case. They want to be able to have a single platform to enable all these functions. And we were finding ourselves kind of losing out on data quality opportunities because people wanted a single stack for MDM. So we moved, we recognized that this was a kind of a key differentiator for us. As we went into the market, we didn't want to just do the same old thing because we recognized a lot of the challenges and a lot of the frustration that was out there in the marketplace. So we chose Graph and we chose Neo4j at that point to really enable our master data management solution. Why did we choose Neo4j? There's several reasons. It's Java-based, so that fits our core product architecture quite well. It supports multiple platforms, which we also have a need to support various flavors of Unix and Linux and Windows. Very high performance. Supports kind of ACID control over transactions, operational and real-time, very strong support there. And the very clear market leader at that time, and that still remains the case today. If you look at the statistics that are gathered about the graph market, it's not even close in terms of market share when you compare Neo4j to a number of others. So those were some of the reasons that we wound up focusing on and choosing Neo4j. Our implementation, we have a number of things that we kind of wrap around Neo4j. We embed it in an OEM style. We allow for visual management of the schema. We have support for visual query building, visual discovery of data, exploration of data. We wrap a SOAP and REST layer around it to support real-time queries and updates. A number of features around security, so being able to specify who can modify certain entity types and relationships and so forth. We integrate it with a general paradigm we have called Spectrum Data Flow. Spectrum is the name of the product. The general piece that you build within Spectrum is called the data flow. That usually takes the form of either a batch job or a real-time service, and we have a client for building those things. So things like populating the graph, things like connecting to existing ETL sources, things like integrating with that paradigm, maintaining metadata counts, so how many entities, how many relationships. We wrote a little bit of logic around threading to deal with concurrent access, different access modes, and deadlock recovery retry a little bit better. We added on top of it an NLP-inspired browser that deals with the metadata that you model within the solution. So if any of you all have ever used Facebook's graph search, it's very similar to that. It allows you to use the metadata terms on the model you've built to explore the data, so very powerful. Doesn't require writing any SQL or any traversal code at all. And finally, we added an audit and history layer to it to allow, some of the key requirements in this space are supporting, regulatory requirements. We have to be able to go back and audit, produce reports for auditors about who's modified the data, what's the history of the data, how has it kind of changed along the way. Everybody's probably familiar with some of the disasters that have happened as it relates to customer information out there in the marketplace in the last several years. we're really kind of wrapping both the security layer and the audit history logging layer around our product to have a little better support for dealing with situations like that. So where we arrive with our product is really what we consider to be a best of suite information management approach. And I mentioned that before. This is really key to our marketplace, is being able to provide a platform to support all functions. So that includes data modeling, which in our case is graph-based modeling, whiteboard style modeling within our solution. Data integration to be able to pull data from existing silos into a centralized hub. Data quality to be able to clean it up along the way, validate, standardize, match, dedupe, enrich. Data enrichment, we have a very strong set of location-based reference data for enriching with location elements. MDM, which is really where the graph plays a key role as a persistence layer. Data governance to kind of add rules along the way to support dealing with exceptions. So things like a match process that's a little too fuzzy, or a address that didn't validate, or a geocode that didn't quite go to the level we expected. Be able to build rules around that and route it out to kind of a business user focused portal for remediation and correction. Predictive analytics on top of that, so that includes things within the graph around influence and other centrality focused measures, as well as some more predictive type analytics that allow you to plug in models to determine next best action as we're talking to the customer, propensity to churn, propensity to cancel, things like that. So combining those together with the influence measures can be a very powerful solution. And finally, we have a federation layer that's really kind of separate from the graph components, but I'll talk about just briefly that it enables more of a registry style pattern for access to data, virtualizing access to different data systems, whether they're relational systems, Salesforce, Siebel, flat files, Cassandra, a number of NoSQL sources. Sometimes we find that it's the case, and I spoke to a customer about this specifically yesterday, where security requirements dictate that they're not allowed to store data in different places other than their core system. So we'll sometimes write a virtual view to be able to access that data and provide the appropriate security on top of it, but not pull it directly into a repository that we maintain. So that's another piece we can offer. So when we talk about building solutions within the graph for customer information management, it's kind of a 5-step process that we talk about. The first, again, is modeling to a business outcome. So understanding a use case, understanding a requirement, here are the questions that we want to be able to answer quickly and easily about our customers, and iterating over that. So this is an example of one we put together for an insurance company over in the States that looks at the agents. Policies are underwritten by agents. Policies have both core locations and risk locations. Policy holders hold policies, and then they have contact information. So this is one example. This is actually a screenshot directly from our solution of a model, a virtual model we can build. Next, after that, we talk about kind of an orchestration process that, again, works in sort of an iterative wheel around analysis of the data. So once we've built the model, where the really heavy lifting begins is sourcing data from our existing systems into that model. So that begins with profiling and discovering those existing systems. What data assets do we have out there in the enterprise that it specifically would feed this model? What kind of state are they in? Frequently you'll find things that are default values or null values or inappropriate values within specific fields in a customer database. So we got to be able to take a look at that. As we push data into the data hub, we have to be able to standardize it, validate it, a lot of times match and dedupe and consolidate, enrich it along the way, again, to add that location-based context, and then constantly monitor what's going on and continually kind of move around this wheel to improve our information management practices within the enterprise. Integrate, so these are kind of pieces of that last slide. Integration and federation, we have a lot of support for different kinds of data sources, specifically relational systems, obviously, where most data resides. Unstructured data is a newer area where we're adding some support. Relational systems, cloud-based systems, you can see kind of the full list here. As we talk about data quality and process governance, this is an example of actually work that we're doing within Pitney Bowes as part of a kind of a strategic project that we have ongoing with our own customer data. So this is an example of using the product to standardize addresses, validate them, inject that exception process around data governance, append information from Dun & Bradstreet for DUNS number, build some scorecards, and experience strategies around that, and identify duplicates. So all of these are things that after we've modeled, after we've extracted, we want to be able to apply these processes to the data before we push it into our hub, because as everybody knows, there's not a lot of point in building a hub or something you're going to use for analytics if you push a bunch of garbage data into it, or duplicate records, or invalid data. It's going to result in the opposite effect. You're going to wind up driving incorrect insight, incorrect strategy based on that. So it's very key to apply those kind of processes up front. Combine it with insights. This is kind of a traditional view here. Who are our high spenders? What is their propensity to buy our product? Location context, with things like geofence, and how does that influence the way that I'm marketing? And then some of the things that the graph is really great at as well, that Neo is really great at. So who are the influencers within this community? Combining that with information around who the high spenders are, who the most valuable customers are. Understanding influencers is really a key aspect to how a lot of organizations are doing marketing and customer experience these days. And things like recommendation engines, which is another area where Neo really shines. So looking at a product mix, looking at people that are connected in some way to this particular customer. What products do they own that this person does not yet own, and what can I kind of cross-sell or upsell to them based on that information. Neo's great at that, and we're leveraging that quite heavily. And then once we've pulled the data in, we can do visualization exercises on it. So understanding, for example, in this case, we've got a contact with the same name that's represented both as an organization and as an individual. We can see here one of the other things we provide, in addition to kind of a visual way to explore our data, is a browser-based search type engine. So very similar to, again, to Facebook's graph search technology. It uses the metadata from the models that you've built to explore the Neo graph. So this is an example of taking that same contact and seeing, okay, she shows up as a contact on a commercial policy, but she also shows up as a primary individual on another policy. Let's look at her information as it relates to the commercial policy. Well, here we discover she's the CEO of that company, right? So that's an important thing to know if we interact with her on an individual basis as well. We have to understand the importance of and the context around this individual outside of just maybe an individual policy that we have represented. So we can search and kind of model to that end as well. Finally, a lot of what's involved many times is integration of what we've put into the knowledge graph out to other applications. So there's a way within our design client to quite quickly validate query results within the visual analytic engine, and then take those same queries and put them into real-time web services to allow integration with other applications in a real-time mode out in the enterprise. So the benefits of all this, again, I've hit on these pretty heavy all along, I know, but supporting an agile and incremental approach, it doesn't just support getting things spun up quickly, it also supports evolving them as the business evolves, right? And that's really key, because again, what we know from our experience with agile over the last 10 or 15 years is that the only constant is change, right? So we got to be prepared for that. And quite simply, a lot of the traditional solutions that use relational technologies are not well prepared for that. Really fostering that collaboration and trust between the business and IT to allow your real subject matter experts on the business to model to a specific business outcome, and then work with the IT department to identify, okay, where do I need to source this information from? How do I make it trusted through the data quality processes that I mentioned? And then, the end goal is to deliver value to the business and give them access to information in a timely manner, in a relevant manner, in a performant manner across different domains and through context in knowledge graphs, right? So there's a lot of advantages that I'm sure you guys have heard about quite a bit as it relates to graph as compared to relational. So the ability to not only model to a business outcome, but the performance as it relates to highly connected data. Relational tables break down pretty severely at scale when you have to do joins. Joins are also very complex to write from my own experience, right? You'll wind up with multiple pages of a SQL statement that's very difficult to understand and interpret, and forget about trying to hand it off to somebody else to kind of support, right? So a lot of advantage there is, as you guys know, the graph is built for traversals, and it's a lot better at that kind of activity than a relational schema would be. So validation of our approach as it relates to the various analysts that kind of look at our space. There's a couple of really strong ones here, and I know I saw Emil in one of his earlier presentations talk about Gartner. This is, I think, a quote from the same report where they talk about how business situations where graphs are a great presentation framework is very staggering, and certainly we're seeing a lot of validation of that in our own customer base. And the other big one that I really like to emphasize here is Forrester. Michelle Getz is an analyst in this space who looks at solutions around MDM specifically. And she spoke at an event late last year in New York City, an MDM summit, and talked about both Pitney and Neo4j and our partnership together, and really about how the mindset around MDM is changing, right? And people are starting to recognize a lot of these challenges that I've talked about. They're starting to recognize that a new approach is really needed because a lot of these implementations are failing and failing pretty spectacularly. So she talked about the intuitiveness, the analytical nature, and how it just allows you to be a lot more intelligent with master data within the enterprise. In terms of futures for our own product roadmap at Pitney Bowes with this product spectrum, we're exploring some other ways where we can use the graph. One of those is at a metadata layer that we're looking at building to understand where data comes from within the enterprise, so that discovery and profiling and metadata process. So things like, what are the workflows for data? Who are the users? What reports are they looking at? What governance rules do we have in place? What are the source systems that all this data is flowing from? Being able to represent that in a graph is something we're definitely kind of charging forward with. Data quality visualization, so when you look into specific processes around DQ, especially as it relates to matching, there's some very powerful things you can do with visualization to look at people that I've grouped together, matching collections, do they belong together or not, validating that. Hierarchy management is a big piece of MDM. Right now we have the solution for that is the graph model, but we're looking at building maybe some more kind of purpose-built solutions for that as well. And finally, one of the big pieces we've added in a recent version deals with unstructured data and extracting information from unstructured data. So things like address and location information, things like customer names, being able to pull that out of the various documents and then link it into structured data elements using all the processes that we mentioned before in support of data quality. The last slide here is really about some recent client wins that we've had. We've brought in 2 new key Lighthouse accounts. I can't talk about them in a lot of specificity because of the fact, we're still a little bit early in some of the relationships and not quite partnered to the point of being able to mention specifically by name. But they're both retail organizations, one in the financial sector, one in the automotive sector. And one of them's in Europe, the other one's in the United States. Both have a general desire to master their customer information from all the different silos that have existed. And have a desire to really be able to grow their revenues through an increased understanding of their customer base, to understand those complex relationships that we talked about where the graph really shines, and to really, they've seen very limited ROI, as I've talked about quite a bit already, as it relates to their existing MDM investments. So they want the graph, they want all the power that the graph provides, all the power that Neo provides, but they want to combine that with capabilities for ETL, for data quality, for governance. So that's essentially kind of what's happening at both these accounts. So this kind of concludes the presentation. We have a link there. I think these slides are being provided to you all. It's all about staying ahead of your customers' needs and their preferences and really getting that accurate picture across your enterprise. Where most frequently we see data that's very fragmented and of very low quality. So bringing all that together using data quality, integration, governance, in combination with everything that the graph can provide, it's a very powerful story and one where we're seeing a lot of successes out there in the marketplace as it relates to customers that we're winning, analyst coverage, as I mentioned before, and all the things in between. So that concludes my presentation. Thanks a lot.